Assalamu alaikum everyone. Hope you're all good. The topic that we are discussing these days is Tragedy and Tradition by Raymond Williams. It is Asma Afzal here, and I hope that you're all good. Uh, in the previous lecture, we discussed Raymond Williams' views on tragedy and tradition, and in this particular lecture, we will take it a little forward. In the previous lecture, we also explored the relationship between tragedy and tradition, how it basically develops and how it moves forward, how they are part and parcel of each other, and how much important they are for each other. In this particular lecture, we will explore the development and evolution of tragedy over the passage of time. We'll start from classical tragedy and take it towards modern tragedy. Uh, so let us get started. If we talk about classical tragedy, we know that classical tragedy basically originated from the religious festivals and rituals of the Greek culture. They organize these cultures annually, these festivals annually, and different tragedians used to participate in those festivals, and it was Dionysian ritual that they actually performed. Since it was the originating point, and classical tragedy was quite unique and genuine in its approach, it was not something that was there before that, and it was not following anything. It was quite genuine, and it was based upon the predominant beliefs and faith of the people of that culture. The beliefs that were very common in that particular culture, since art is a representative of a particular culture and particular period, particular era, particular people. So, of course, it tackles with the common beliefs of that particular culture. If we look at classical tragedy, we find out that it is quite metaphysical in its approach, and the major forces that drew behind the tragedy that actually brought about this tragedy are fate, necessity, chance, and God. These were the key elements, the key forces that brought about the tragedy of the protagonist. So it is quite supernatural and quite metaphysical in its approach. And it was considered that the suffering of the protagonist is basically the suffering of everyone, because the protagonist was taken from nobility, from a people, from a person of upper rank, and nobility was considered to be the representative of all the people. So it was considered that the suffering of nobility is suffering of the common people also. Uh, since tragedy is representation of a particular culture and particular traditions, particular era, so with the passage of time, when those cultures, those traditions and norms, that era changes, tragedy also changes, art also changes. So as the Greek culture took play went through a lot of changes, the classical tragedy also changed, and the chorus, that was one of the key elements of classical tragedy, was discarded. It was not discarded overnight, it was not discarded in a moment. It took a lot of time, and it was discarded slowly and gradually. It basically evolved into a new shape, but it was ultimately discarded, and with that, the unique meanings of classical tragedy were also lost. According to Raymond Williams, there is one big mistake that we commit, and that is we relate permanence with art. We think that art is permanent in its nature. However, we need to understand that since art is a representation of a particular time period and a particular group of people, a particular culture, and its norms and traditions, so it is particular in its approach. It is not permanent. It can be representative of one particular culture and one particular era. It can be relatable to that particular culture and era, but it cannot be a representative of another particular culture and era, and it cannot be relatable with that. So it is not permanent in its approach. It is not something that is for everyone and for all the people of all the times. We need to get rid of this notion. And he says that since the circumstances and situations change, so the representation of those circumstances and situations also change, and hence tragedy also changes. Raymond Williams says that it is not that we lack the evidence, but we fail to use it because it doesn't fit our idea of tragedy. He says that we do have enough evidence and enough proof to understand this lack of permanence in the meanings of art. Um, but we do not agree with it, we do not follow it, because we have this strong notion and idea of tragedy in our mind, which says that tragedy is permanent, that art is permanent, and we do not basically agree, and we are not willing to get rid of that idea, and that is why we do not agree with this notion. Then we move forward towards medieval tragedy. Uh, Medieval tragedy went through a lot of differences. It was different from the classical tragedy in a number of terms, in a number of ways. However, it still held major parts of classical tragedy. It was not altogether different. Since we say that tragedy is basically that evolved, it did not change all of a sudden, it evolved. And when we talk about evolution, evolution takes place very slowly and gradually. In evolution, things change very gradually, and there are no sudden and abrupt changes. So we see that from moving from classical tragedy to medieval tragedy, we will find out a number of differences, but there will be certain things that are still retained. Okay. So the first difference that we see in medieval tragedy is that the governing forces basically changed over here. There, the governing forces were quite supernatural and metaphysical in their approach, as we saw that there was chance and necessity and fate and gods that were the governing forces behind tragedy. But here, those supernatural sort of forces are basically replaced by circumstantial forces. Here, the protagonist is not bound by those supernatural forces, but he goes through a lot of social upheavals and struggles and social imbalance and such sort of problems that basically bring about his tragedy. Here, the two main forces that are dominant in medieval tragedy are feudalism and the church. In the classical tragedy, it was gods, the oracle, because it was about Greek culture, but in medieval tragedy we're talking about Christian culture, so here the church is more important. And then there was nobility that was considered to be more important, but in medieval tragedy nobility is replaced by feudals. And another difference is that in Greek tragedy, the tragic change was from happiness to misery. The protagonist, the tragic hero, basically went through a change that led him from happiness to misery, and this was something that was considered tragic. However, in medieval tragedy, the change does not come about in these terms. However, the change is from prosperity to adversity. It is more material. We see that medieval culture, medieval era is more worldly and more materialistic. So we see that the misery and the change that brings about the suffering of the tragic hero is also more material. So now the suffering and the tragedy is not about moving from happiness to misery, but from prosperity to adversity. However, the tragic hero himself remained unchanged, and there were no major differences. It was quite the same person. It still held a very strong rank in the society. It still was important figure in the society, and it still was considered to be a representative figure of his age. And the suffering of the tragic hero was considered to be the suffering of the entire age of the entire society. So there is a precise emphasis on the fall of famous men. There is a very mild difference between the tragic hero of classical tragedy and medieval tragedy. In classical tragedy, the tragic hero was taken from nobility only, and it was considered that nobility is the representative of all the people, and the suffering of nobility is representative of the people of the state. However, this concept changed, and here, since nobility is replaced by feudals, so again the tragic hero is taken from the ruling class, from the famous people, from feudals, and he still holds quite a strong rank in the society, but he is not from nobility only. He can be taken from a little less ranks also, and it is considered that the fate of the ruling class is the fate of the city. It was basically a thought, a belief of that particular culture, of the people of that particular culture, and it was considered that the head of state was basically treated as the head of family. Just as the suffering of the head of a family is the suffering of all the people of the family, all the members of the family, so is the case with the state also. The suffering of the head of the state is basically the suffering of the entire state. Then we move towards Renaissance tragedy, and here a very major difference takes place. Here, those metaphysical uh, approaches, those metaphysical forces are replaced, and in the classical and medieval tragedy, there was one common thing that we saw, that religion was there. Religion was holding a very strong position. In classical tragedy, it was in the form of gods and oracles, and in the medieval tragedy, it was in the form of church. However, in Renaissance tragedy, it is basically replaced by science and learning. Since Renaissance is the age of revival, it is the age of scientific learning and explorations, so it was replaced by that. However, materialism that was there in medieval tragedy is still there, and it has gotten very strong roots here. Materialism is even more strong. Okay. And one important thing that is altogether new in Renaissance tragedy, that is individualism. Here, the focus on individual, the focus on person is very strong. Every person is considered to be very important. Every person is equally important. Now, it is not necessary to have a member of nobility or feudals to represent the suffering, or to represent the entire society. Everyone of the society is considered to be equally important. The tragic hero of the Renaissance tragedy is fallen to supernatural riddles. He has to solve certain sort of supernatural riddles, and there is a lack of balance between his knowledge and those riddles, and his lack of explorations, which basically brings about his tragedy. And the other important thing is that the fall, the tragedy, the suffering of the tragic hero of Renaissance tragedy is brought about by his own faults and desires. It is he himself who is responsible. Since we are talking about individualism, so we see that now it is not gods or oracle or fate or chance or church or anything else that is responsible for his tragedy. He himself is responsible for his tragedy. It is his own deeds that basically bring about his tragedy. So this is basically about his own life and about his own deeds. The term that we use for it is hamartia, the tragic flaw, and hamartia basically talks about the faults, about the errors that the tragic hero commits. He himself is not somebody who is altogether a negative person or an altogether bad person. He is a good person by nature, but he commits certain errors, and because of those errors, his tragedy is brought about. Then we see a very complicated sort of relationship between Renaissance tragedy and between the previous tragedies. We see that there in Renaissance tragedy there is a competition and relationship between the inherited order that represents the previous tragedies, something that he has inherited from the previous tragedies, and a new humanism, a new consciousness of humanism. And in Renaissance tragedy, we find out an amalgamation of both, of the inherited culture and the new humanism. So, what is humanism? Humanism is basically a cultural movement that was brought about in Renaissance. And according to humanism, a person has a lot of capacity for self-realization through reason. And there is a rejection of religion and supernatural forces. So religion and supernatural forces are not considered to be important anymore, and it is thought that the man himself is capable of doing whatever he wants to. He can explore as much as he wants to. He can get as much as he want to. There is no limit to his capacity. There is no limit to his explorations. So the focus was given to the man himself, to the person himself. So it can also be related with the fact that now the rank was not considered that much important. It is not that the rank was gotten rid of altogether. The rank was still important a little, but now it was considered that each and every person of the society is equally important. Each and every person's suffering is equally important. We cannot say that the suffering of nobility and the suffering of a person from upper rank is more important and more representative of the age and society, and the suffering of a common man is not as much important. So Renaissance tragedy basically is not metaphysical in its approach anymore. It has gotten rid of those metaphysical elements, that were supernatural elements, and now it is more critical in its nature. Then we see that Raymond Williams thinks that Shakespeare was not the real inheritor of Greeks. He did not basically inherit the Greek culture. However, he presented, or he started a new kind of tragedy. And it is also thought that the Elizabethan tragedy, the Renaissance tragedy, is the point which anticipates the humanism and romanticism which was going to come in the later times. Renaissance tragedy is also considered to be the starting point of secular tragedy, since we see that here the religion and the religious forces are not given any important any longer. So it is not altogether secular. It has not abandoned religion altogether, but it does not give that much importance to religion either. Okay, religion is there, but it is not as much important as it was in medieval time periods and in classical time periods. So it is the point where the secular tragedy basically started. Raymond Williams says, in one sense, all drama after Renaissance is secular. So that was all about Renaissance tragedy. In this lecture, we have discussed three major tragedies: classical tragedy, medieval tragedy, and Renaissance tragedy. In the next lecture, we will take it a little further and we'll move towards modern tragedy. I hope you could understand it, but if there are any questions or any confusions that you do not understand, you can ask me anytime. I'll be there for you. Stay safe, stay happy. We'll meet in the next lecture. Until then, Allah Hafiz.